Your Honor, just briefly.
If you would.
We had, Your Honor, I think we had also addressed just a couple of minor factors that are more typos that I won't go into, but we editing some language out of the prior incident.
Yes.
Instructions to leave just the instruction as the court had previously given the jurors about the May 2019 incident.
And the decision was made that no, Derek Chauvin would not testify in the proceedings. Now, this next portion that we're about to show you happened outside the eyes and ears of the jury. They were not in the courtroom when he invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege. Judge Cahill and his defense attorney, Eric Nelson, walking him through this process.
Mr. Chauvin, you and I have had several discussions throughout the course of my representation of you relevant to your right to testify or to choose to remain silent, correct?
That's correct.
And during the course of our representation, it's fair to say that you and I have had this conversation multiple times, correct?
Correct.
You understand that you have a Fifth Amendment privilege to remain silent. Do you understand that?
Yes.
You understand that if you choose to exercise that right to remain silent, neither the state nor the court can comment on your silence as a sign or an indication of your guilt. Meaning they can't say, he didn't get up and defend himself, so equate your silence with guilt. Do you understand that?
Yes.
All right. Now, you also understand that you can waive that right and testify. Do you understand that?
Yes, I do.
You understand that if you chose not to testify, or if you did in fact testify, you would be subject to cross-examination by the state of Minnesota.
Yes.
You understand that if you were cross-examined by the state, we could not attempt to limit the scope of your testimony. The state would be given broad latitude to ask you questions. Do you understand that?
Yes.
We've had this conversation repeatedly, correct?
Correct.
I have repeatedly advised you that this is your decision and your decision alone, right?
Correct.
I have advised you, and we have gone back and forth on the matter, would be kind of an understatement, right?
Yes, it is.
But after a lengthy meeting last night, we had some further discussion, agreed?
Correct.
And have you made a decision today whether you intend to testify or whether you intend to invoke your Fifth Amendment privilege?
I will invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege today.
So again, Chauvin there asserting his right not to testify. He will remain silent. The jury will be instructed on the fact that they cannot use his silence against him. I just wanted to read you, Amy, a quick quote from a family member of George Floyd's family. A cousin, Arthur Reed, was in the courtroom. Our pool court reporter caught up with Arthur Reed afterwards. The announcement that Chauvin would not testify. Reed telling the reporter, quote, the prosecution would have chopped him down, meaning Chauvin, second by second. We didn't think they were going to put him on at all. Reed going on to say, we're just ready to get this over with, make sure Chauvin gets the justice he deserves. We think the state has put on an excellent case. So some confidence there from George Floyd family member. They were in the courtroom for this moment as Derek Chauvin dramatically made the final call that he would not testify during his trial.
And Paul, I just wanted to ask you quickly, now that we've seen the totality of the evidence and heard all the testimony, was there anything from the beginning now that has stuck out to you as a surprise or something you did not expect by way of evidence or testimony?
Well, the one thing that came into mind just in terms of what maybe didn't get in as evidence, you may remember we did a lot of talking leading up to this trial, kind of Derek Chauvin's prior, bad acts, bad deeds on the police force that the state had fought hard to really get in. And those were never introduced, not through Madera Arredondo, not through the police department. I don't know if they were kind of keeping that in their back pocket in case Derek Chauvin actually testified, and then all of a sudden they would spring sort of his past actions on the police force upon him, and perhaps going into his rationale to not testify and not subject himself to the to a cross-examination that would have been absolutely vicious by the state. And just one kind of point I want to add to his decision not to testify, and if you listen to his Q&A with his attorney there by his side, he'd taken the mask off, and they had that Q&A in court where Eric Nelson said they had a real lengthy conversation last night. I truly believe that this decision came down to the very last minute. I had some sourcing close to the defense that said coming into this week the decision had not been made, that it would be a, quote, game time decision, and I think it was, and they decided overnight. Derek probably slept on it a little bit, and he decided in the end not to testify. All
right, Paul Bloom for us. Thank you, Paul.
Let's bring in our legal expert, attorney Mike Bryant. Hi, Mike.
Today.
I'm doing well. You know, I just want to kind of piggyback off of what Amy just asked Paul. A lot happened today in a short amount of time. Did anything take you by surprise?
Today, no. You know, we were waiting to see whether the defendant would testify, but it didn't surprise me when he chose not to. There was going to be the motion on whether they'd get a rebuttal witness, and the judge was really strict about what that rebuttal witness could say. But no, that was all pretty consistent as far as today goes.
And when it comes to closing arguments on Monday, deliberations will follow. Can you kind of walk us through that process? Will the jurors have an opportunity to kind of look back at evidence, at exhibits that were presented during the trial?
Yeah, the jury will get all the evidence that came in except for the illustrative evidence. Illustrative were things when they said they were introduced for illustrative purposes, it was just to show the jury, but those weren't going back to the jury room. So things like that model of the oxygen going up and down and those kind of symbols aren't going to go back to the jury room, but they'll get everything else. Plus, I think the judge said today they're going to get a computer with speakers and be able to play all the videos. So they're going to get everything that went into evidence.
So the jurors are heading into a long weekend. They will not be in court on Friday. Quite a few people took the stand. I believe about over 35 witnesses when you combine the prosecution and the defense witnesses. Do you think that there's any testimony, at least in your opinion, that kind of stuck out and may stick with jurors heading into this weekend?
Well, I think the videos will stick out to the jurors, and they saw a number of different videos. They got to see video of George Floyd alive in cup foods. They got to hear the defendant on videos talking. So they got opportunities to get more things to the videos. As far as individual testimony, a lot's going to depend on what they think of the experts. If they, like a particular expert, or they thought a particular expert was very helpful, that'll play a big role. But there's two parts to the case. There's the action, whether or not he violated the reasonable police officer standard, and two, whether or not that violation, if they find that, is what caused the death. So, there's a number of things for jurors to think about. Now, they're not supposed to be talking to each other, or they're not supposed to be doing any deliberation until they've gotten all the evidence and they all get in the room. And then when they're all in the room together, then they can start talking about, deliberation and talking about what they think of those things.
All right, Mike, thank you. Appreciate you weighing in.
And our special coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial continues. We'll be right back with the final testimony in the case. Stay with us. Welcome back to our coverage of the Derek Chauvin trial. The final testimony focused on a pulmonologist who took the stand last week.
He previously said Floyd died from a lack of oxygen due to the pressure of Officer Chauvin's weight. Fox 9's Leah Bino joins us with more. Leah.
Yes, this was the witness that the state wanted to call back to the stand during their rebuttal, and they did, but there was some work to be done to get him to that point. So basically this morning, during about an hour time frame before the jury was brought into the courtroom, the state wanted to introduce some new evidence. Now this stems from testimony yesterday from Dr. Fowler, who the defense called, and he had alluded to some questions about carbon monoxide levels in George Floyd's blood and kind of opened up a door there, offering kind of a question mark around the fact that George Floyd was near a car exhaust. Well, apparently after that testimony, we learned through the prosecution that the medical examiner was listening and looked back through the file and found that he indeed did have some blood gas test results that apparently were never turned over with the rest of the medical information that was requested for this case. And now the reasoning for that Jerry Blackfell with the prosecution explained was that it was never brought in, it was never part of the record, even though it was tested back in May, basically because nobody at the hospital requested that the carbon monoxide reading be included, so thus they thought it wasn't relevant. Obviously a lot of questions there for Judge Cahill about the timing of that and whether or not this would be appropriate to bring in this new evidence. But here's what Judge Cahill had to say about his decision not to allow that information into the case.
First of all, in dealing with these lab test results, I find that Dr. Fowler's report gave sufficient notice to the state that the carbon monoxide that potentially was in George Floyd's blood could have affected cause of death. I read page 15 of his report, which I don't have at my fingertips at this point, that basically they said Dr. Fowler came right out and said it should be tested. That gave the state notice with sufficient time in February to either test the samples that are still there or to dig a little deeper. It's just by serendipity that Dr. Baker calls the state and says, oh, by the way, it does exist. It should be in there. It seems to me very odd. I'm not claiming any bad faith on the state's part, but it seems odd that Hennepin County Medical Center, when they're asked to turn over all their records, that they don't include records that maybe are just buried a little deeper. I think their response to the subpoena is probably insufficient in and of itself. And they should check their standard operating procedures so that in the event this happens again, that they will supply all the information they have. But in any case, the defense gave notice that this was going to be an issue and specifically talked about testing the sample. The state had sufficient time to investigate and disclose to, even if it's just because Dr. Baker called the state and said, we can actually find this, at 8 o'clock this morning, when the state is, or the defense expert is done testifying, has left the state. It's untimely to give the notice, and it prejudiced the defense by the late disclosure, even if it's not due to bad faith. But the late disclosure has prejudiced the defense. It's not going to be allowed. So Dr. Tobin will not be allowed to testify as to those lab results. If there's anything he wished to add about carbon monoxide as far as environmental factors, but if he even hints that there are test results that the jury has not heard about, it's going to be a mistrial.
As you heard there, a very definite line drawn by Judge Cahill. Ultimately, Dr. Tobin was allowed to testify and be the rebuttal witness for the prosecution, and here's some of that testimony.
Dr. Tobin, as you prepare to tell us why these results, in your opinion, are not reliable, could you please help the jury to understand something about oxygen saturation testing in the blood?
Right. So if you have, like was done in Mr. Floyd, when he went to Hennepin County, he had an arterial blood gas obtained. So that's sticking a needle into the artery at the wrist, and you take out the blood. And then on the blood gas measurements, you measure a number of different items on that, like the pressure of oxygen in the blood, the pressure of carbon dioxide, the amount of acid in the blood, called the pH, and you get all these different measurements, and you also get the oxygen saturation, and that is how much of the hemoglobin, the protein in the blood that carries the oxygen, how much of that hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. And we know in Mr. Floyd that it was 98% saturated.
So 98% saturated with oxygen?
With oxygen when they measured it in Hennepin County. And
So
that was 9/16, the time frame.
So if we know that there's an oxygen saturation of 98%, does that tell us anything whatsoever?
Yes,
about what?
I'm
About,
sorry, I interrupt. I apologize.
Does that tell us anything whatsoever about what the carbon monoxide content could have been at a maximum?
Yes, it does. It tells us that if the hemoglobin is saturated at 98%, it tells you all there was for everything else is 2%, and so the maximum amount of carbon monoxide would be 2%. It tells you the maximum amount of carboxyhemoglobin. That was what was mentioned yesterday. The maximum amount is 2%. It doesn't even tell you that it is 2%. It could be something else. But 2% of carboxyhemoglobin is within the normal range. You and I have levels of carboxyhemoglobin of somewhere between 0 and 3.
And so in other words, as to the statement that his carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18%, in your view, that's not possible.
It's simply wrong.
Now, Eric Nelson did follow up with a couple of questions to Dr. Chauvin, mainly about articles that he had included in his report when he submitted that to the state back in January, but didn't really get into a whole lot of specifics. He did mention at one point that his main star witness, his physician that he had called yesterday, Dr. Fowler, that kind of spurred all of this, he was actually on a plane, so Mr. Nelson was unable to reach him, so that might have complicated some things. But all in all, BC and Amy, it was about an hour and a half, less than 2 hours, before the jury was sent home for the weekend for the day and awaiting that Monday closing arguments.
All right, Leah, thank you. Up next, more legal analysis on today's developments in the Derek Chauvin trial. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. We want to bring in our legal expert, attorney Mike Bradshaw, one more time. Mike, what do you think Eric Nelson will focus on in the closing arguments? He's moved between a few different causes of death during the course of this trial.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't have to prove what caused the death. He just needs to point out that there's a bunch of options out there on the cause of death. And so that's what his expert gave him, is it's undetermined, and there's all sorts of issues out there, and they can't just be, the state can't just be close enough. So he'll focus on what his expert said about the use of force and that the reasonable officer. So he'll spend some time talking about the crowd, I would guess, and the conditions that were going on at the time, and that the defendant isn't a doctor, so he can't make doctor decisions out there. And then he'll focus on that even if you get to the point where you think, geez, he shouldn't have done this, or he should have done something different, it all comes down to that wasn't the cause of death. So that would be what he'll most likely focus on. And then he'll leave part of his closing will be somewhat reflective of what the prosecutor says first, because the prosecutor go first, then he'll go, and then the prosecutor will get up and give some rebuttal that's now allowed in Minnesota.
And Mike, after hearing all the witnesses, whose testimony stuck with you the most?
Well, it's kind of a combination of things. What stuck with me as far as this trial goes was the videos. I mean, the videos were amazing on how much we saw from videos. We heard from Chauvin. We saw George Floyd alive in cup foods. We saw, what happened from a number of different angles. We saw witnesses that testified early in the trial, and then we saw those same people out on the street and were able to reflect upon their testimony versus that. So those were very different, and those were, a look into things beyond just testimony that was major. Then the experts played a big role in this, how they feel about certain experts. I don't think it was a fluke that the state wanted to put up the expert that they did back on there again, to give the jury one more reminder of who he was and what his testimony was.
Mm-hmm. All right, Mike Bryant, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Coming up on the special Derek Chauvin coverage, Judge Cahill's instructions to the jury as everyone prepares for closing arguments on Monday. Stay with us.